My name is Katie Lennon, class of 2017, and I have the honor today to introduce a very special guest here at Regis Jesuit. Brother Guy became an astronomer and professor of astronomy before deciding in 1983 to join the Peace Corps as a way to contribute to the world outside the confines of a university. He was assigned to teach astronomy to the university students in Kenya, but he often found himself admiring the night sky. In 1989, he returned to his devout Catholic upbringing and an early desire to join the Roman Catholic Order of the Society of Jesus. 2 years later, he was called to the Vatican Observatory at Castel Gandolfo, Italy, the Pope's summer home, to do astronomical research. A specialist in meteorites, he became the curator of the Vatican's meteorite collection, one of the world's largest. Consolmango divides his time between Castel Gandolfo and the Vatican's observatory on Mount Graham, near Tucson, Arizona, where he studies the Edgeworth-Kuiper belt of planetoids. Often referring to himself as a missionary of science, he travels widely and was part of a team of astronomers who determined that Pluto is no longer a planet at the meeting of the International Astronomical Union in Prague of 2006. Please welcome Brother Guy.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. There was a title of a talk I was thinking of giving during this time, but after speaking with people this morning and seeing the size of the audience here, I thought I would rather talk to you a little bit about my vocation as a scientist and as a Jesuit, because I know a lot of you are going through this, what the heck am I doing with my life, and what should I be doing with my life questions, and if you're not, you ought to be. And I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a scientist. Now, I grew up in the 1960s. I was in kindergarten when the first satellite was launched, Sputnik. I was a senior at the Jesuit High School, U of D High, when people landed on the moon. Science was in the air. Certainly as a smart little boy, and boy, I wanted to be known as a smart little boy, because what's more important than being smart is being known to be smart, especially when you're a kid. So I was, of course, interested in the sciences. But I also knew that the best high school in the Detroit area was the Jesuit High School. So I went to U of D High. When I got there, I was told all the smart kids do Latin and Greek. So I went into the classical honors, put science aside. After 4 years of doing Latin and Greek and trying to figure out, am I going to be a lawyer? Am I going to be a journalist? Am I going to be who knows what? I was looking for a college to go to. I imagine a lot of you are looking at colleges. So even though it was 50 years ago, nothing's really changed all that much. My dad was from Boston. There are a lot of great schools in Boston. Boston looked like an attractive place to go to school. I liked the Jesuits. I thought I got a great Jesuit education, so I applied to Boston College. They accepted me. I show up fall of 1970. And they put me in the freshman dorms. Now, first of all, when I get there, I've got to choose a major. And I'm looking at everything that you could major in. I'm looking for the box that says all of the above, because I want to learn all this stuff, because this all looks really cool. I finally chose history, because I figured history is the story of everything, right? And I want to learn everything, you learn history. But I get to the freshman dorms, all male dorms, with a bunch of other 18-year-old kids who are living away from home for the first time in their lives, in a place where though the drinking age was 21, the local liquor store would deliver to the freshman dorms. Right. And I discovered that my classmates were the kinds of idiots who thought that was a great idea. I remember one time there was a party on the floor, and this guy shows up with a bottle of rum and a tin of smoked octopus. And he manages to down both of them. And soon thereafter, he's looking for a place to get sick. And so he's wandering down the hallway. He sees the men's room, and there's the trash barrel. You go to the men's room, go to the trash barrel, go to the men's room. Trash barrel's closer. But when I go to the men's room, I have to take off my trousers. So he's standing in front of the trash barrel and takes off his trousers and carefully lays them over the trash barrel and then gets sick into them. And the smell of smoked octopus and stale liquor is permeating the hallway for the next month. As my fellow idiots are pursuing these things, they discover that, maybe they're not doing all that well in their classwork. Maybe they're not doing, their lives are beginning to fall apart. And they see me, I tried drinking once, and it tasted like mouthwash. The stuff is expensive, and it tastes bad. You could use that same money to buy chocolate. Come on. So these kids would start coming to me, and they would pour out their problems to me, and they'd say, what, I'm doing this, because I'm the one guy on the dorm floor who still has his act together. And as they're pouring out their problems to me, I keep thinking to myself, life is tough when you're stupid. Why are you telling me your problems? Why do you think I care? I couldn't stand it. I hated being in the freshman dorms. So I figured, what's the fastest route to get out of the freshman dorms? Well, what else was I thinking of doing? Well, I was thinking maybe in the back of my mind being a Jesuit. I'd met this really cute girl at the beginning of the term, and she was dating my roommate, not me. So, evil. So clearly there was no future for me there. All right. I go and find a Jesuit priest. And I go up to him and I say, Father, I want to join the Jesuits. And he says something really weird to me. He goes, son, I hate it when they call you son. Son, have you prayed about this? I mean, prayer? I'm 18 years old. Who prays? Come on. Oh, I guess it goes with being a priest. You're supposed to do that prayer stuff. He goes, go to your room, close the door, and ask God, is this what he wants? Yeah, well, okay, so I kicked my roommate out, which was fine because I didn't like him. Close the door, sit on the floor, and I'm staring at the ceiling, and I'm saying, okay, God, here I am. I want to be a Jesuit because I'm really desperate to get out of the freshman dorms, and Jesuits are cool, and everybody thinks they're smart, and they get to wear black stuff so you don't have to worry about what to put on in the morning. And I don't know. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing here. And I'm waiting for a sign, waiting for a voice from the ceiling. Don't hear a thing. While I'm waiting for the voice from the ceiling, a weird question pops in my mind. Like, what does a priest do for a living? I mean, we're talking about a job, right? This is going to be your job, being a priest. What does a priest do for... I know what they do on Sunday. You can see that. They get up and tell everybody else how to live their lives. I'm good at that. But Monday morning, I guess priests must have desks, right? I've never seen one, but I assume they must have a desk. They probably have papers on their desks. What are those papers about? Those papers are probably about people who have come to see them. People with problems. People just like the jerks I'm trying to get away from. This would be the worst job in the world for me to take. I have a feeling life is tough when you're stupid is probably not good pastoral care. Well, if I'm not set to be in the priest team, what am I good at? Guy, you're a nerd. Yeah, I know. Guy, you're a nerd. Why don't you go to nerd school? What do you mean? Your best friend from high school, he's at MIT. You've been there visiting him. They've got tunnels you can explore. They've got weekend movies. They have at MIT the world's largest open shelf library of science fiction. Did I mention science fiction? You could transfer there. I'm a history major. I don't have to. You could transfer there and tell them you're going to be a journalist, a science journalist. So I do the interview just to say, oh, science journalism, what great thing. That was the flavor of the week that week. They let me in. They accept me. But I had to choose a major again, and I checked, well, I'm not going to be an engineer. The only thing I can make with a hammer is noise. I'm not going to be a physicist, come on, physics with a history background. I don't think so. But I saw a major called Earth and Planetary Science. Planets. Planets are places where people have adventures. This is as close as I'll ever have a chance to be somebody who studies science fiction. I check that off. I show up at MIT. I discover that the department I've checked off is actually the geology department. Geology. Rocks. Who wants to study rocks? Like, oh, there's a rock. There's another rock. Geologists have to go out and climb mountains, I don't want to climb mountains. I want to sit in a comfy chair and read a book. But then I found out that there are rocks that fall out of the sky from outer space called meteorites. You can hold outer space in your hand. And I was hooked. There's the weird thing. My career, the stuff I've been doing professionally for the last 50 years, was based on a series of, let's face it, really goofy decisions by a stupid 18-year-old kid. And someday you will be a stupid 18-year-old kid making the same sorts of decisions that will be changing your lives. And you know what? It didn't turn out all that bad. One of the reasons that I was able to succeed as a scientist was because I'd gone to a good high school. I'd gone to a Jesuit high school. I was a class 6 major. Now sciences are great. Math was great. I took calculus because, hey, who doesn't want to learn calculus? But the things that I learned in high school that turned out to be incredibly essential for my career as a scientist were things I would never have guessed. You'd think, oh, you're going to be a scientist, you better take physics, you'd better take chemistry. Oh, of course, you're going to take those things. But frankly, you're going to take them again when you get to the university. You're never going to stop taking physics, you're never going to stop taking chemistry. And if you miss one of them in high school, you can catch up. But what does a scientist actually do for a living? You make some experiment, you make some observation, you come up with some theory, lovely. But you've got to tell people about it. If you don't tell people, it didn't happen. If you don't write it down, it didn't happen. If you don't tell the world, it didn't happen. How do you tell the world? You have to be able to know how to write. A vast majority of your life as a scientist is going to be writing. You'll have to write articles, you'll have to write journal essays, you'll have to write proposals, you'll have to write letters to your colleagues. If you cannot write in such a way that other people understand you, you'll go nowhere. if you can write in such a way that your ideas really get communicated, even though there's 5 other people who have the same idea, if you can communicate it better, they're going to remember yours. One of the big science things I did in grad school, I presented a paper at a meeting, and the guy presenting right before me had done exactly the same work. But he didn't speak English as his first language, and he didn't know how to put together an entertaining talk. And while I recognized what he did, most of the people in the audience didn't. I don't know where he is now, but that paper made my reputation. Turns out it was wrong, but it made my reputation. Not only do you have to be able to write, you have to be able to do public speaking. I took a speech class in high school. I thought it was the world's biggest waste of time. It's what I do for a living now. Things that I learned from my high school speech teacher. Things that I learned from doing forensics. Things that I learned from doing debate. Things that I learned from doing theater. To have an idea of how to connect with an audience so that you're standing here and I'm looking at individuals to try to remind you that, yeah, I see you. To know how to modulate your voice so that people pay attention. To have that sense of timing. These are how you communicate. Nobody teaches you this at MIT, trust me. Nobody teaches you how to write at MIT. Bigger than that, when you have a scientific idea and you want to communicate it, you do it with a figure. How do you learn how to draw a figure that people will understand? I hope you've taken some art classes. I hope you're taking some class where you learn how to understand illustration, how people have done it, how you can do it. You're not going to get this at MIT. Most scientific papers at meetings are not delivered by people giving talks like this. There's just too many scientists, too much work, not enough time at a meeting. The best papers are the most interesting papers. You may get 8 minutes to try to describe what you've done in the past year. The most you can do is an advertisement. Hey, these are my results. Come read my paper and find out. The fact of the matter is, most scientific papers are now delivered as posters. A piece of paper, 1 meter by 1 meter, where you have the title, you have the people who did it, you can show the graphs that show your data, short explanations. Where did I learn to do that? I was on the yearbook. Learning how to lay out a page on the yearbook is where I learned how to lay out a poster for a meeting. And where did I learn that? Not at MIT. I learned it in high school. Now is the only chance you're going to get to learn these tasks. But wait, there's more. When I'm a scientist and I have a collection of data, when I have a bunch of observations and I'm trying to tease a story out of this, I take the picture that I've seen, I take the data that I've seen, I take the individual bits and I pull them apart and put them back together and see how the different bits work, analyzing the data. Where did I learn to do that? They don't actually have a class at MIT about how to analyze data. You know where I learned to do that? There was a fellow named Father Polakowski who taught poetry. I learned how to analyze data by analyzing T.S. Eliot poems, pulling them apart, putting them back together. Let us go then, you and I, as the sun is spread across the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. You go, what? Why did he use that imagery? Why did he do it in that phrase? This is the effect he's trying to get across. Margaret, are you grieving over golden grove unleaving leaves like the things of man you with your fresh thoughts care for? Can you? That's a weird way of making a sentence. Why did Hopkins do it that way? Hopkins put it together that way to communicate these ideas with more than just the words, but it's the rhythm, it's the story behind the story. I learned to do that in English literature class. Who thought that English literature was going to be an essential part of being a scientist? A question for the school, an embarrassing question. Do you have Latin? Do you teach Latin here? Yeah. I want to tell you something that maybe you have heard from your teachers and probably didn't trust them. When I was a professor, I discovered that the best physics students were the kids who had studied Latin. Now, there's two things going on here. Number one, Latin, this very rigid, structured grammar, again, you understand a Latin sentence by pulling it apart and putting it back together. The same technique you need for analyzing data in science. There's also the effect that the smartest kids are the ones who went into the Latin track. But, so that may have had which is the cause and which is effect, I'm not sure. But being able to have any second language means that you are used to seeing the universe from more than one perspective. There are things that Italian can express that English cannot. And things that English can express that Italian cannot. Now that I live in both languages, I see the world with two eyes. Being able to recognize how the world works from more than one direction is an essential part of being a scientist. One last and important thing about the life of a scientist. You heard in the introduction that I was in the Peace Corps. You've noticed that I told you how I didn't become a Jesuit. When I was 30 years old, I was a postdoctoral fellow at MIT. MIT, it's the big league. I went to MIT. I love MIT. It's nerd school, and I fit right in. MIT is not for everybody. If you're trying to figure out who you want to be with your life, don't go there because they're not going to tell you. And if you want to learn science but also learn something else, you're going to learn the same science at any school that you learn at MIT. You just have weirder roommates when you're at MIT, which can be fun. But by the time I'm 30, I'm at MIT. I'm a full-time researcher. I'm getting paid by a grant from NASA to write computer models that will explore the nature of the icy moons. Little did I know that 30 years later it's going to be really exciting and people are talking about finding life in these moons. Actually, I talked about finding life in the moons too, but when I was writing science fiction. You've never read any of my science fiction. Nobody has ever read any of my science fiction except my closest friends who tell me, well, I've read worse. So, okay, I'm not going to be a writer, that's okay. But I'm lying in bed at 3 in the morning, 30 years old, thinking, oh my gosh, how did I get to be 30? 10 years have gone behind. No one told me when to run. And I'm wondering, why am I wasting my life studying astronomy when people are starving in the world? I'm working so hard to write a paper that 5 people will read, and even if the ideas are important, in 10 years' time, everything I've written will be obsolete. And meanwhile, people are starving in the world. And I had no answer for that. I had no reason to keep doing science. Plus, I'm 30 years old. I'm old. Not a kid anymore. I was used to being a kid. I'd never been anything but a kid. And suddenly that was ending. And, I didn't have any debts to worry about. My parents were in good health. None of the women I dated wanted to marry me, so that was one less problem under the bridge that I didn't have to worry about. I only dated smart women. I could do anything in the world I wanted to do. I didn't have to stay at MIT. So, Have you ever had that feeling you can do anything in the world you want to do, and you don't know what it is you want to do? All of my life up to then had been to be preparing myself for something. Oh, you got to be really good in high school so you can get into a good college. Oh, you got to be really good in college so you get to graduate school. Oh, you got to be really good in grad school so you can get that first job, so you can get that second job, so you can get that. I had been 5 years a postdoctoral fellow at MIT and Harvard, which meant that I couldn't get a real job. And I quit. I said, the heck with this. I've had enough. Now's my chance to go off and do some good for the world and maybe have an adventure. So I joined the Peace Corps. Well, the first thing that happened when I joined the Peace Corps was they sent me to Africa, and I was homesick like nobody's business. There was no internet in those days. There was no way, you write a letter and it would be a week before it got to America and another week before the answer came. I was so homesick. This was even during training. I hadn't even, started my job. I was so homesick that I was physically ill. I had stomach problems. Most of the people were off someplace, and they left me behind all by myself in the training camp because I was too ill to travel. And I realized, okay, I'm a nerd. My idea of a good time is not to climb a mountain, but to sit in a comfy chair and read a book. What am I doing in Africa? What am I doing so far away from home? I'm going to tell them tomorrow, send me home. Clearly, this was a mistake. Well, if they're going to send me home tomorrow, tonight is my last chance here on the equator under dark skies to go out and see if I can see the Southern Cross. Always wanted to see the Southern Cross. I look up on my book, and sure enough, if you get up at 4 in the morning, you can see the Southern Cross rising from this part of the world at this time of the year. I get up at 4 in the morning, and I see the Southern Cross, and it's really cool. And then I turn around, and to the north, there's the Big Dipper and Leo the Lion, and there's Orion setting, and there's the summer stars rising, and all the stars that I had grown up with in Michigan are still there visible. They're my friends. I'm thinking, why am I homesick? When I can see these stars, I am at home. Oh. So I stayed. I stayed there, and the first thing they were going to do was they were going to send me to teach science at a little high school up middle of nowhere, up country, where there was no windows in the windows and no black on the blackboards. And I said, yeah, I'm going to do something good for people for a change. And after about a week of training, they took a look at my background and said, okay, we'll put you in a government school, one that at least has windows in the window. Okay, whatever you want. I don't have an adventure, an agenda. I will go wherever you want to send me. At the end of training, they put me in the best high school in the country that had computers. This is 1983. They had computers for the students. They had like lasers in the physics lab. Okay, well, I can teach these kids. 2 months later, they pulled me out of that school to send me to the University of Nairobi to teach graduate students astrophysics. Astronomy. I could have done that back in Boston. Why am I doing astronomy? I'm in Kenya. People are starving. I went over there with a group of 75 other volunteers. Most of them were up country, where there's no black in the blackboards. And every weekend, I would go up with a little telescope that I brought and set up the telescope, and they would introduce me to the people in their village. And everybody in the village would look through the telescope, and they would see the craters on the moon and go, anybody here ever see the craters of the moon through a small telescope? And then, I pointed to Saturn. Has anybody here ever seen the rings of Saturn through a small telescope? Not nearly enough of you. I'll tell you one thing you will never find. You will never find anybody who's ever seen the rings of Saturn through a telescope and not said, oh, wow, because they're amazing. And everybody in Kenya, of course, is seeing them and going, oh, wow, because they're amazing. Exactly like my friends and neighbors back in Michigan would go, oh, wow. Because that's what people do. That's what human beings do. You look at the sky and you wonder. You look at the sky and you go, oh, wow. And then you ask, what are those things? Who am I that I can understand these things? In those days in Kenya, I had a very clever cat, but my cat never wanted to look through the telescope. Human beings look through the telescope. Human beings do things that have nothing to do with putting food on the table because we are more than just well-fed cows. We are creatures who dream, who ask questions, who ask the kinds of questions that don't have answers. We are creatures who want to know who we are, what is this universe, and how do we fit into it. And how do we do that? By looking at the sky through a telescope, by writing poetry, by creating art, by doing dance, by doing theater. All of these things that have no practical value, and yet without them, we are just well-fed cows. And then it hit me. You know, we people, we don't just live by bread alone. Oh, actually, I'd read that someplace. It's literally true. Because what I also saw was that people who have their brains stretched by looking at the sky, stretched by trying to express themselves in art, stretched by trying to come up with a piece of music that says what words can't say. These people suddenly have the strength and the power and the ability to handle the other questions about where are we going to get our food from. They have the talent to know how to divide the problems of the world into problems that can be solved now and problems that we'll get to, but I'm not going to worry about them yet. And ultimately, this is what feeds the world. And that's why we do astronomy. And that's why it was important for me to do astronomy. And that's why I went back to America to get a teaching job at a small college doing astronomy. The school I taught at was a place called Lafayette College. Little school in Pennsylvania, probably you never heard of it. Lovely little school. One of those zillions of small liberal arts schools in the world. Probably the kind of place I would have hated. A lot of the kids wound up going, living in fraternities and doing too much drinking. And yeah, I've been there, seen that. But there's more to life than that. And sometimes they're smart enough to grow up out of that. One thing I've discovered about students, people your age. I used to be people your age. Some people say that teenagers are half as mature as adults, and that's wrong. That's not true. Teenagers are every bit as mature as adults half the time. Right? You know what I mean. Yeah. And that's okay. It's also true, somebody, a friend of mine who used to be a teenager and now is the father of teenagers, puts it, I've never seen people who are so self-conscious and so totally unself-aware. So think about that one. But it means that this is the time when you become self-aware. This is the time when you learn to do the other things that will feed you besides just the things that will put food in your stomach. This is the time when you have a chance to daydream and to dream about who you might be, which is going to be different from the person next to you, even if the person next to you is your best friend. This is the time when you decide, what is it that's going to be so exciting that I want to get up and do it for the next 60 years? And if you're lucky, you will find that thing that turns you on, and you will find something that you're actually good at, and maybe even something you can make a living at. This is the essential task that you guys have right now. And the final exam is not something a teacher's going to give you in a couple of weeks. The final exam comes when you look over your life and they ask you to come in front of a high school class and you say, geez, I should be the person sitting in that chair. Because that's where I remember myself being the last time I was at Jesuit school. What am I going to say to them that I wish somebody had said to me? Now's the time to be the human being that brings God's joy into your life. God wants you to be happy. If you're miserable, it's because you're doing something wrong. And now's the time to discover, when you still have a chance to really go for it in the best of all possible ways. I was so happy being a professor at Lafayette College that I decided to do it as a Jesuit. Teach at a Jesuit college, like Regis. Of course, the Jesuits decided instead that I had to go under obedience to move to Rome and eat that terrible food and look at that terrible scenery. But, obedience is obedience. You don't always wind up where you think you're going to wind up, but if you play it right, you wind up in someplace better. Thank you very, very much for having me here.
Thank you, Brother Guy, for that wonderful speech. Let's give another round of applause for him.